drag queen off a half your gag. Is there a point to all these fancy clothes? With all these buckles from your head down to your toes. It's very simple, but I'm just another girl. It's not so easy, but I'm giving it a whirl. Is there something that you're trying to prove? With all the makeup and the way you move, are you looking for some sympathy? No, I'm trying to be the best girl I can be. It's very simple, but I'm just another girl. It's not so easy, but I'm giving it a whirl. Like my martinis dry, cosmos I won't deny. Smoke those long cigarettes. Thank God I'm not dead yet. Done all these crazy things, short of a wedding ring. Just another girl.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Callista Soul, and you're watching NLC Trans. Tonight I'm here with my dear friends and co-hosts, Stacey Dozier and Tara Alexander. And we have two very special guests tonight. We have Bethany Hamilton and Anna Dorgaz. And you guys are from CONSACS, which is the Connecticut Sexual Assault Crisis Services. Let me see if I can get your titles right here. Bethany, you are Prevention and Training Coordinator, and Anna, you are the Director of Public Policy and Communication. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Maybe you guys could give our audience a little bit of background on what it is you guys do. Obviously, we sort of have a pretty good idea from your name, but maybe you could kind of go through a little bit about what CONSACS actually does and sort of a thumbnail sketch.
You want to do that? Well, I guess I can start, and Anna can certainly fill in wherever I am lacking. But basically, we're a coalition of 9 community-based rape crisis centers throughout the state of Connecticut. So you guys obviously have a local program here.
Sure.
We work at the statewide agency, which is up in East Hartford. And we provide services to victims of sexual violence as well as their family, sometimes do stuff within the community. There's some pretty core services that we have at every program. There's a 24-hour confidential toll-free hotline, both English and Spanish. When you're calling anyone from one of our centers, they're going to be certified sexual assault crisis counselors, so meaning that we've had some training, or some pretty good extensive training, around sexual violence, the dynamics, prevention, all that sort of stuff. And we also have statutes, which you can sort of speak to more specifically, that protect us. So in terms of being subpoenaed or the kind of information that we have about clients, that kind of stuff, that would be accessible. We also have support groups at almost every program. They're bilingual and male advocates. One program actually has an LGBT advocate, but there's only one of those in the state out of New Haven. I don't know what else I'm leaving off. I'm sure a lot.
Yeah, the local programs provide, in addition to the support and counseling and the two 24-hour hotlines that you mentioned, we also do hospital and court advocacy. So when someone experiences sexual violence and they go to the hospital emergency room, our advocates can go and be part of the evidence collection process. They can provide support. They can explain what's going on. They can provide information not just to the victim, but also to any family members who might need support or might need some information about what's going on. And then further down in the process, if a sexual assault case goes to trial, our advocates are available to accompany the survivor to court to explain, again, what does this process look like? How's it going to impact you? And then just to provide support through that process as well.
And then as well as with police, so sort of the two in-between steps, the hospital. Oftentimes folks, and for many folks they choose not to report, but for those who do, we would obviously go out when they were doing the interviews with police officers, that kind of stuff, to provide the same kind of accompaniment.
So you guys are somebody we wouldn't want to have to call, but unfortunately, all too often your services are required.
Absolutely, it's one of the things that's super, super common in our society. So if you sort of look at the rates, which we know are super underreported, it's on average about 1 in 4 girls by the time they're 18 and 1 in 6 young men by the time they're 18 will be sexually assaulted.
Yeah, which is crazy. The numbers are just crazy, and really kind of scary. So certainly it's really wonderful that you guys are out there doing this. And hopefully we can get your telephone number up there.
Do you want to put those numbers out?
There's like a main number you call.
Yeah, we have two hotlines. There's an English hotline number, which is 1-888-999-5545. And the Spanish language hotline is 1-888-568-8332. You can double check my work on that just to make sure they're correct. Those are probably two of the most important points of contact. Sure. The hotlines are really good anonymous ways for people to connect directly with our services.
Yeah. So in the obviously we know what happens in the unfortunate event that somebody is assaulted. I'm guessing you contact the police first and then contact you guys, or
that's actually a misconception that I think people have about our services, that you have to involve the police. That's a choice that we always leave to the victim survivor.
Okay.
Because for a lot of people, there can be really conflicted feelings about involving law enforcement in their assault. In particular, because we know that around 90% of victims know their perpetrator, so that kind of complicates the dynamic, that it might be a partner, it might be a family member.
Sure.
So the thought of going to the police sort of introduces this extra barrier and this extra hurdle. So that's a choice that we leave entirely to the survivor. There are only a few limited circumstances in which we would have to involve anyone else for cases of child sexual abuse, in cases where the survivor was assaulted in a group home, or if someone's elderly or has a really extreme disability. In those cases, we would have to follow through and make reports. But otherwise, it's completely up to the survivor. They have complete control over, do I go to the hospital? Do I go to law enforcement? While we encourage, in particular, healthcare follow-up, just because there can be sort of unseen physical consequences to an assault. But our services are really based around the idea that you've had so much power and control taken away from you during the assault, that in the process of responding to that and healing from it, that every single decision needs to be left to the survivor.
I would say for the most part, most people do not go to the police. Or most people don't, and then if they do sort of have the police contact, they don't follow through with that, sort of after an initial contact with the police for the most part, so I would actually sort of think of that being less part of the equation.
But sort of adding to that, there is this really important window period within 72 hours after an assault, if you want to have evidence collected. Sure. That because sexual assault is so unique in that the body is a crime scene, and your body goes through so many changes naturally that after 72 hours, any evidence that's present on the body will start to degrade, or it might wash away. If you use the restroom or have a drink or eat dinner, all of these things can kind of alter the state of the evidence. But I think it's important for people to know that you can have evidence collected and it can be labeled anonymously, and the police can have possession of that evidence without knowing your name and without knowing who you are. So that's something that that I don't think people expect, that, I can have this evidence collected and preserved, and I can give myself time to think about this, but I don't have to make that police report right now.
That makes really good sense. I certainly never thought about that,
But again, that's why a service like Consax is there. I mean, just after a normal accident, just getting hurt somewhere, you're dazed, you're confused, you're in a little bit of shock. In the case of a sexual assault, I imagine quite a bit of shock. And having folks that can sort of provide support and sort of walk you through, okay, what do you want to do? All right, this is where we have to go, this is what we have to do. That shepherding is, and obviously something like this, knowing that there is a 72-hour window, knowing that you can collect the evidence and it can remain anonymous and you can take your time making a decision about what you want to do is exactly what the victims need.
And that's sort of one of the invaluable things, I think, in some ways about our position, is that we sort of get to work with all those systems independently, whereas most folks, unless you sort of have something really terrible happen, you're never going to know what to expect. So we sort of can let folks know across sort of all of their possible outcomes, what that might look like for them, both intended and unintended consequences of certain things.
Yeah, because there's no way to just sort of have an inherent knowledge of what the legal system looks like, or I've never really met anyone who's like, I just instinctively know what happens when you call the police. That these systems are all, they make so much sense to the people who are part of the systems, but to come into that system as an outsider, I think it can be a big shock, because I think we all have ideas about how a system might work, but the reality doesn't quite match up. And when you've experienced trauma and you're sort of in a state of confusion or emotion, that it's particularly hard to take all of that in and digest it and really kind of objectively understand what's going on.
Yeah. And I imagine, with the best of intentions, susceptible to, I mean, in my own experience, I got in a car accident, and the police officer that responded to the scene, I look back on it and it's like, all right, I ended up essentially doing things I wouldn't want to have normally done, because I wasn't that badly hurt. But he's like, well, I really, really think you need to ride in the ambulance, and authority figure that he is, and the situation the way it is, and eventually it's like, well, okay, you must know best. And I'm sure he had the best of intentions, but that can happen. And so it's
I think also
having an advocate is a great thing.
Right. Particularly for folks who've experienced, who are marginalized in other ways, I think that sort of coming up against those systems when historically probably their experiences are not very good.
Sure.
With many of those systems, with the police, with medical professionals, with sort of all these other folks, I think it's extra important for folks to have some support and some advocacy sort of when you're sort of dealing with, particularly if you're talking about trans or queer folks, sort of folks who are more likely to be assaulted, less likely to have support systems, less likely to have access to resources, employment, healthcare, all of those things.
Yep.
So sort of all those things really compound for many, many folks. So it can be much more difficult for some to sort of deal with the trauma.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. The numbers are horrible. 1 in 4 is 1 in 4 and 1 in 6.
By 18.
Horrible numbers. They really are. And I know that the numbers for members of the LGBT community are higher than that, and I think a lot of that is because I know for our community, for the trans community, certainly we have a much higher likelihood of being homeless. And if I'm not mistaken, I may be wrong about this, but I believe that people that are homeless have a higher incidence of being assaulted, and I think those may be tied together in some way, but it really is very, very scary. And it's something that we've had to, post-transition, sort of had to come to grips with the potential. Not that there wasn't potential before, but I think the increased risk factor and certainly being less able to fend off an attacker. So we've sort of had to come to grips with potentially being victims, and so it is very, very scary, and so it's really nice that you guys are out there. I think we actually have a phone call.
Yeah.
Do we want to take that? Yes. Good evening, nlcTrans. You're on the air.
Hey guys, what's up?
Hi.
It's Lee from Listen Up.
I'm sorry? Oh, Lee from Listen Up.
Yeah.
Oh, how you doing?
Don't you guys think that a lot of it is stigmatized by TV to the fact of, I mean, if it happens, a lot of things are asked like, well, did they bring it on themselves, this, that, and the other. People don't realize that there are predators out there, whether they're male, female, what have you. And a lot of it gets stigmatized by the TV shows. Well, were they wearing the wrong clothes? Were they doing this? Were they doing that? So, people that don't come forward because it's a shame, or they think that they themselves have done something to bring it on themselves.
Sure.
I think that's natural to
Okay?
sort of feel that way.
So a lot of times it's the person actually has to look at themselves and say, it's time for me to step up.
Yeah.
To me, that's one of the things that has to be done. You have to willingly stand up and say, this happened to me, and what do we do now?
Yeah. Not an easy thing, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think the piece about the media impacting people's experience with violence is really important, because I think it does two things. To Lee's point, it really does, particularly if you read the comments section of any online newspaper, it's just this awful place where people say, oh, well, this happened because of where the person was, or what they were wearing, or who they were with, or what they were doing, or what their job was, that there's so much victim blaming, and it's not just the comment section. It's how the story is presented, in the main article. It's how we talk about it, in the news media. It's the stories that we choose to cover in the news media. And then I think that's the second part, is what sorts of assaults are portrayed, whether it's on Law and Order or in the news. What we tend to see are assaults that are, especially in a fictional context, are extremely violent, that have a stranger for an assailant. And I think people see that, and they might say, oh, well, what happened to me doesn't match up with everything that I've learned from television, everything that I've learned from the media, so I must not be a victim. Yeah. When I hear the word victim, we have this sort of cultural definition of victim that looks a particular way, and if someone has an experience that doesn't match up with what they've seen in the media, I think there's a tendency to say, oh, well, I don't know what happened to me, but it wasn't sexual assault, because this is what I know about sexual assault.
Right. And I know something that the last time you were on, we had talked about was sort of the notion of, you don't have to get hurt physically to be the victim. You don't have to have bruises. You don't have to go to the emergency room to have been the victim of a sexual assault. But that is what you see in the media. Is, well, he didn't hit me. I didn't end up in the emergency room, so it couldn't have been an assault. And it's just not true.
In fact, in most cases, that actually is people walk away with no outward physical signs of having been sexually assaulted. Yeah. And lots of times even, we just recently did a training with the folks at the crime lab, and in many cases where there are known sexual assaults, so folks have actually, admitted to having committed them, there still is no physical evidence, in the evidence collection kit when they're being done, that kind of stuff. So really sort of, not only in the state to prove things do we look for that preponderance of physical force, but sort of when you see the descriptions, absolutely like folks are talking about, you tend to think of it as happening a very, very certain way. Right. And in most surveys that are done, particularly with women, that have been recreated for years and years and years, many folks, you'll ask them directly, have you ever been the victim of a rape? And they'll say no. They don't identify as a victim in any way, shape, or form, but then you go down 30 questions and you say, has anybody ever forced you to have sex you didn't want to have? And they say yes. Has anybody ever coerced you into having sex you didn't want to have? And they say yes. So some of that, I think, really is just about perception, too, and that folks don't want to identify as a victim.
Right.
And then there are all of these other stigmas that go along with the word, that victims are, they're weak, they weren't in control, they made a bad decision.
Right. So they didn't stop it.
Yeah, so I think with those negative associations, nobody wants to say, I'm a victim.
Sure. Because
that comes along with so much other baggage when it's a really pretty simple thing that, were you coerced or, forced to have sexual contact against your will? Was this not your choice? And when you phrase it like that to people, they can describe experiences where that's exactly what happened. But if you pull in the word victim, so, well, that's not me. I'm strong. Yeah. I don't make bad decisions. Sure. I don't relate to that word.
Right. That's interesting. Are you still with us, Lee? I think he... Well, anyway, Lee, thank you for calling. That was a very good point. And haven't seen Lee in a while. But anyway, thank you for calling. It was nice to hear from you.
One other thing that I might say, just to sort of follow up on his point, too, in terms of sort of folks needing to stand up and sort of name their experiences. I think for some folks that's not always as easy or as possible as it is for other folks. So if you are a young trans person of color who is unemployed and homeless, you going to the police to report that you've been sexually assaulted is going to be taken completely different than if you live in West Hartford and you have a very different background, whatever that looks like.
Gee, you picked West Hartford.
I know, and certainly we've seen some of the cases that have come out of West Hartford, what that's looked like, that kind of stuff. So I think that sort of thinking that victims should have to stand up and name their experiences to sort of hold folks accountable isn't always true or isn't always as reasonable an expectation for everyone.
Yeah. There may be an aspect of it, I'm thinking, that owning it for yourself, admitting to yourself, being able to talk, even if it's just to yourself or to contacts, about that event, I would imagine is part of the sort of moving past healing process. Even if you don't end up involving law enforcement, you don't go necessarily everywhere with it, just being able to admit it to yourself and stuff is, you know, maybe dialing back what Lee's talking about a little. But I know in our experiences, accepting who you are and what has happened to you, these are the experiences of my life, has been a really big part of finding a way forward. Yeah. And I'm guessing that's true in assaults as well. Like you'd said, but when you ask them, have you ever been forced to have sex against your will? Yes. Okay.
There's a name for that.
That does count as sexual assault. You know, we can find other words for it, but you've been sexually assaulted. And it's okay that we use those words because they do have consequences.
And being able to separate the stigma of those words from the experience, because they're two completely different things.
And I just keep sitting here thinking about how easy it is for people to stigmatize it without perhaps not even realize that's what they're doing. If someone in the media, for instance, says, now what can people do to prevent this? Then all of a sudden the message is, well, that was preventable. So now that's victim blame as well, and that seems like that can be
and the
dangerous
things that
too,
they say
and you can't do that.
to do to protect yourself are things that they do on college campuses across the nation, which is give kids rape whistles or set up these blue boxes that they can go to and stand by and hope that somebody's going to get there in time.
Right.
Or, you know, those kinds of things. Carry mace, don't walk alone, you know, don't go with anybody you don't know, that kind of stuff. And all of those things are not actually risk reduction strategies that are going to prevent sexual assault.
Right, yeah, nothing is going to absolutely prevent it.
And not that those are bad things, but yeah, it's I get that. We've sort of had to learn the situational awareness, and it's very important. But it can be so very subtle. I can tell you from personal experience. I mean, obviously, I was abused as a child when I was a young child, but that's a whole different thing. But post transition, I can tell you that. That I sort of, and for us, I think we have to sort of go through this learning process, and a lot of it is sort of, some of it is sort of stuff that we might have learned earlier, but we weren't able to do that, and we sort of have to kind of go through that. And having, you know, been with men post transition, I found I was surprised. I was very surprised by how much sort of coercion there was, and how easy it was to. And I don't want to suggest that I was really victimized by anybody, but there was sort of a learning process in there, and I was with one particular man who I really did feel like I was losing control, and I had to sort of get away from him. But it was a very new experience for me to be sort of in that position where I really did start to feel like I wasn't in control of the situation, and it was difficult. It was difficult to sort of. It was sort of after the fact, looking back at it and saying, you know, in fact, crying for long periods of time and looking back and saying there was something wrong with that experience. But it's sort of, it's not an easy thing. It's not easy, even when things are happening, to know exactly, I think, what it is that's happening. And so I guess, long story short, I guess I sort of get that it's not always black and white. It really isn't. And so if somebody's running after you with a butcher knife, it's easy to know that you need to run. But certainly what goes on between people and sort of the emotional and mental things that go on and
well, I think it's just sort of in the case you're talking about too, where there's this moment, there's this encounter where you want to be intimate with this person, and you look back on it later and you go, but that's not where I wanted to end up.
Right.
That's further than I wanted to go when I went into it.
Yeah. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly where I was going with that, but it is sort of, I did sort of have to learn how easy it was to sort of not be in control and to feel like I was somewhere I shouldn't be, and to sort of, I don't know, feel like some of it really wasn't as much my choice as
Well,
maybe I thought it was.
one of the things I remember the last time we talked, we had you on the show, we had talked for some time about the fact that you don't have to say no for it to count as sexual assault, for it to count as a forced, event, and that feels like some of the stuff you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is you don't have to say no to have been forced.
Yeah, and I think we lose sight of this idea that consent it's a positive. It's something you agree to. Consent isn't the absence of no. Consent is the presence of yes.
Right.
And I think, because we couch everything in negatives, that, well, no means no, and, if anything bad happens, run away or scream, that we teach people how to be afraid and to react in fear, and we kind of put the onus on the victim to, well, if you're not comfortable, you have to fight and scream and, and cry and say no a whole bunch and say it loud enough for people to hear. But we don't address potential offenders and say, you need to get clear consent. You need to make sure that your partner is a willing partner. You need to communicate that yes. And, it doesn't have to be, would you like to have sex now? Yes? Okay. I mean, it doesn't have to be such a clear statement, but there are very clear ways to communicate consent, and there are very clear ways to communicate a lack of consent. But I think that sort of goes back to our ideas about what does sexual assault look like, and it looks like either somebody makes a bad decision and then something bad happens to them, or it looks like, I was minding my own business and then I had to kick and scream and fight back. But there are so many other scenarios that fit that description of sexual assault that completely fall off of our cultural radar.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's like I say, it's not black and white, is it? And
But I think you did a great job, too, in some ways, of really articulating what that experience is like, because I've actually heard sort of some of your comments from other folks that sort of innately learning, I say this all the time to Anna, but sort of that learning that being female, an unavoidable consequence of being female is that you will experience violence. So sort of getting used to the fact that other things, sort of, your settings or your surroundings used to sort of be safe, and you have to get readjusted to a world in which you're not safe, and you're expected not to be safe all the time. So I think you actually, I want to sort of thank you for articulating that, because I think you did a great job of doing that.
Thank you. It's been sort of an interesting thing for us, just sort of realizing, interesting for me to realizing some of the things that, and these were sort of unexpected consequences of transition that, it's funny, transition is one of those things you plan this, you read everything, you plan, and this is what's going to happen, and there's always things in there that just blindside you. And certainly that was one of them, sort of the way some of those interpersonal things work, just like, wow.
The interpersonal relationships are going to change slightly, but you get surprised by how exactly, and sometimes how dramatically.
And to have the realization of just how many interactions that we have are gendered, that where you don't necessarily think of a lot of sort of daily interactions as an experience that has some kind of gender built into it. But, I mean, even the experience of walking down the street, that I think, as a female, you say, oh, well, these are the expectations of a female walking down the street alone at night. That I can't have safety because I've been taught that this is not a safe situation for females. Where I speak to male friends who say, oh, I never would have thought of that. Because that's not something that's been taught to them. That's not sort of how our society views sort of a male gender, that, well, you're safe. But as Beth was saying, we know that 1 in 6 men do experience sexual assault. And back to some of the earlier points about naming the experience, when we're told that sexual violence is a crime that impacts women.
Sure.
That
Right.
we leave out those 1 in 6 men who are experiencing the same kind of violence as well. We don't allow them to name their experience as sexual assault because it's a women's issue.
Yeah, when it's 2.5 to 1. The ratio there is, or 1.5 to 1. 1 out of 4, 1 out of 6. Is,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I wouldn't have guessed that either.
But there's, I mean, there there is a good amount of experience, people we know, that as young boys were grabbed and worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know the notion that, well, you know, a boy when he gets to be 7 or 8 years old is starting to be a young man and is able to take care of himself is a fallacy.
Well, and that being assaulted is somehow a failure to take care of yourself.
Right,
As though,
right.
well, I as a 7-year-old boy did something wrong for this to happen. I mean, when you really think that through, what a terrible burden to place on victims of any age or any gender. But that so feeds into the way that we see this and the way that we talk about sexual violence and other kinds of violence. I mean, no wonder there's this stigma. No wonder victims are so sort of reticent to disclose.
Yeah.
I think it also touches on another thing about sexual violence is that you carry it with you for the rest of your life. It's not something that you sort of ever, for most people at least, sort of are able to sort of deal with and sort of place on a shelf. It's something that you revisit all the time, sort of whether you want to or not. You know, some things sort of bring that up for you and that kind of stuff. And I think for many of the victims that we work with, they are folks who have experienced childhood sexual abuse and now are adults who are sort of trying to put that in place, or they just had a child of their own and that's really changing and bringing up stuff for them. So I think that it really is something that will affect people over the course of a lifetime.
And I need to say, in my own experience, I've met a couple of people through work in other venues who didn't really address or deal with childhood sexual abuse until they were again assaulted as a young adult. And as a young adult with a different mind, different mindset, a different environment, really decided, I need to go do something. I need to go talk to somebody. I need to go, and then the fact that, for 6 years when they were living, XYZ, the babysitter would touch them or something, it starts to come out, and it's only because it happened again. And which is, I don't know how, I believe that it's very common for
re-victimization, sort of once you've been re-victimized, you're I've read up to 3 times more likely to be assaulted than over the course of a lifetime.
Yeah. And you're starting at 1 in 4 and 1 in 6.
Which is underreported, I would
Which
contend.
is underreported. Yeah, so you're talking about a healthy segment of society.
It's scary, it really is scary. But yeah, it's something that sort of we've had to come to grips with, is the potential for that.
Well, and interestingly, to draw in something else here, the anti-discrimination bill that's before the Senate
Yes.
I wanted to talk about that, so I was very happy.
has certainly had a, oh gosh, I actually think I have, actually, the quote-unquote bathroom bill, as they describe it, which they do talk about the opposition to the bill, the fact that somebody might cross-dress in order to gain access to the women's restroom in order to assault a young girl, does nothing to address the assaults on young boys. And their latest little flyer, if you haven't seen it, is this, we showed this last week, is the symbol for the women's restroom that has the word men underneath it in order to highlight the threat of a sexual predator pretending to be transgender in order to gain access to the women's restroom. And I don't know if you can talk a little bit about what we know about the motivations. It's if I understand right, it's a crime of power, not a crime of passion, right? And so it really doesn't have anything to do with having sex.
Yeah, and I think I was really hoping that this bill would come up, in part because the Senate's expected to take a vote on it tomorrow.
Today or tomorrow, so please contact your senators. Go to ctequality.com and read up on how you can contact your senators to ask them to vote in favor of the bill.
Without amendments.
Without
No
amendment.
amendments.
Ask them to bring it up for a vote. Ask them to vote for it without amendments. Email them. Call them. The contact information is all on ctequality.com.
In fact, Anna, you testified at the Judiciary Committee hearings.
I did. I testified at the hearings. We had some of our advocates from our local rape crisis program submit testimony as well. And then kind of behind the scenes, Consax has been sending letters to legislators to really, in particular, address this bathroom bill misconception. I mean, on the one hand, it's just incredibly offensive on a number of levels to refer to a bill aimed at promoting equality as to reframe it as a bathroom bill.
Absolutely.
But it also, it's really dangerous rhetoric because it spreads false ideas about who offenders are and who victims are. That it really taps into this fear that people have that, you know, everybody wants to keep their children safe. That's such a good instinct. It's completely understandable. We want safety. We want safety for ourselves. We want safety for our families. But when we say that you're less safe, they're giving one group of people in our society equal rights, makes other people less safe. That's such a dangerous equation, and we know that, like I said earlier, that 90% of assaults are perpetrated by someone who's known to the victim. And in child cases, that percentage increases, that it's somewhere between 95 and 98% of child victims know their offender in advance of the assault. And
So we need to emphasize this.
yes.
90% of assaults are by people who know, or are by perpetrators who know their victims.
90% or better.
And with
better.
children, it's 95 and up.
Correct. And
It's not the stranger following your kid into the bathroom.
no, well, and in part because offenders look for opportunities where they feel safe, where they feel safe as perpetrators, and public spaces tend not to be, you know, and again, I don't want to make blanket statements and say it's never happened that, because everything happens. at some
Everything
point.
happens eventually.
But ultimately, when we latch on to this idea that, you know, if only we deny transgender individuals' rights, if only we keep them out of our bathrooms, that, you know, then we'll be safe. But that message is so dangerous because as everyone's sort of breathing this collective sigh of relief that, oh, well, you know, this great menace we don't have to worry about anymore, even though I would disagree with the idea it's a menace to begin with. But when we say, oh, well, now we're safe, now we don't have to worry, you know, our bathrooms might be safe, but is your home safe? You know, that you've protected little Johnny or little Sally from this evil that's not a real evil, but we're still entrusting them to a babysitter, to an uncle, to a father, to, you know, to the kid next door who really is a threat. And when children hear that message from their parents that watch out for strangers in bathrooms, again, it's about who identifies their experience as abuse. That if all you teach your children is watch out for strangers, watch out for people who are different than you, that when their assailant is someone who they love, who they care about, who's been granted access to the home, who's not some kind of other, but who is someone very close to the victim, then the child might think, well, I've heard about abuse, and this is what abuse looks like, and this wasn't my experience. So I don't know what my experience was. It was uncomfortable, it was painful, I didn't like it, but it's not abuse. So I don't need to talk about it. I know that I need to tell an adult when I'm abused, but I guess this wasn't abuse. So it's such a dangerous idea to put out there, and it's such a red herring from what the problem actually is.
And that's probably the message to parents, is if you want to protect your kids, if you want your kids to tell you when they've been assaulted, when they've been touched inappropriately, you need to stop with the inaccurate rhetoric.
And the frankly, the opponents of this bill are fighting this in a way that is not unlike some of the struggles we've had in the past with civil rights in this country. And I think they will be remembered in the same way as these opponents of civil rights in the past are now remembered. And that's something
I would
that's
hope
probably taken into consideration.
Yeah, and it really is. It really comes back to this idea of safety and wanting to feel safe. And to me, that idea of safety really ties together so much of what we've been talking about. That why do we stigmatize victims? Why do we tell ourselves that victims have made bad decisions? Why do we tell ourselves that perpetrators are somehow outside of who we encounter every day? Well, we tell ourselves that because the truth of what sexual violence looks like is so hard to deal with and makes all of us so vulnerable that it's so much easier to push the problem to a place where it doesn't really exist, to push it completely to strangers, to push it completely to particular kinds of people who go certain places or wear certain outfits or do certain things. Because again, it's a really hard, I mean, I don't have any children of my own, but I imagine, well, what does that conversation look like? That, I'll teach my child to be wary of strangers, to be cautious, to sort of engage in the standard kind of risk reduction strategies. But still, when I think about it, it's a hard conversation to have, to say, well, not only do you need to be cautious of strangers, you need to worry about daddy. You need to worry about all of the people who I love, who I trust not to be a menace to my children.
Right.
But it's really hard for the message to be essentially be scared of everyone.
Yeah, how would you possibly function if you were going around day to day doubting everybody around you? The next person you see could be your potential assaulter.
Yeah, and it's hard because that's, clearly not the way that not the way that you want your children to grow up is not interacting with anyone. But we need to teach children and teach ourselves to at least be alert to that possibility, and to accept and to put it out there that it's okay if this is your experience, if this is something that happens. It's not because you were bad. It's not because you made a bad decision, and it's okay. It's okay to share that information, and it's okay to identify that experience as something that was wrong and uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
It's tough to go very very many different places with the notion of the bathroom bill.
Yeah.
One of the things that not even so much for on the sexual assault side, but one of the amendments that was proposed in the House is being proposed again in the Senate to add gender identity or expression to the sex exception to the anti-discrimination laws for bathrooms, locker rooms, and single-sex sleeping accommodations. And I remember in the House debate, one of the comments that got made a couple times was, I don't want to have, I want to have the sex talk with my kids when I want to have it, when I feel it's appropriate. They're only 8 and 9 years old now. And the first thing out of your mouth is, that's too late.
And we were talking about this in the car on the way up, that in a way it's very sad to me that you would tell your children, that's information, you can't have this knowledge. Right. That you saw something or experienced something or heard something, and we're going to shut that down. Because that's exactly the kind of rhetoric that, taking it again kind of beyond the piece around bathrooms and moving it back into a conversation about violence, that when you tell children, well, we don't talk about that. We don't, we don't name those body parts. We don't. When you cut off knowledge, that's a great way to cut off disclosure, to cut off things that can be helpful and can help a child feel like the experience was bad. It's not that all sex is bad and that all bodies are bad and that all experiences involving your own body are bad. It's being able to say some of those experiences are good and should be good, but some of them aren't, and let's name those and let's help you understand those so that when those come up, you're not so ashamed that it involved a certain part of your body that you can't tell anybody.
Yeah.
That you can say those body parts, you can reference those, because sometimes it's so important.
Right.
In fact, every bit of research that's been done that shows sort of how to, quote-unquote, protect your children is exactly contrary to that. It's actually, you teach the kids the names of body parts, you teach them about sexuality, you teach them as much as they can.
Age-appropriate, but frank.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, in reality, if folks want to keep their kids safe, you actually would start those conversations as soon as they were able to recognize parts of their bodies.
Yeah, because if your kid can't tell you, so-and-so touched my penis, they're not going to tell you.
Right.
You know, on the note that we had talked about earlier of sort of treating boys and girls the same because they are both almost equally victims, what they kept talking about was, I don't want to have to explain to my daughter if she sees something uncomfortable, something that I find uncomfortable in the bathroom. But there was no, but okay, so if you don't let me use the women's room, I'm going to use the men's room, you're going to have that conversation with your son. Why doesn't that bother you equally?
Yeah, well, and it's really sort of ignorant to this point of keeping adults safe as well.
Yeah.
That what restroom is going to keep you the most safe?
Yeah.
And that's a piece of violence that we know that's real, that when people present their gender in a particular way and they're forced to enter a space where people are going to say, wait, you don't belong in here, that we know that violence is real.
Yes.
We don't have evidence saying that there's any sort of real violence associated with people using the restroom that comports with their gender expression or their gender identity. But we can point to instances where it's unsafe for people to go into a space that doesn't match their presentation.
Yes, absolutely.
And you know, I mean, just there was an incident in Florida, I think it was last year, and there was an incident in Maryland just last month, or earlier this month, where which we showed here, where the trans woman in Maryland was attempting to use the bathroom and was at McDonald's and was in Baltimore, just outside of Baltimore.
Nearly beaten to death.
And was confronted on the way out of the bathroom by two other women who proceeded to beat her and drag her by her hair around the restaurant until she went into convulsions and the police showed up. So yeah, the violence is real.
Yeah, there's violence, but it seems to be
It's directed at the trans community rather than by.
Senator Bai was very quick to point out.
In fact, there was news just from this past weekend, from yesterday, today's the 25th, from yesterday about another transgender assault in Virginia.
Right.
Not bathroom related, but if we can take 2.5 minutes, we can show that clip.
Oh,
if it's okay.
Yes.
Life is when I actually got knocked out.
Still fearful, she wants her identity protected, but this 32-year-old Fredericksburg woman is speaking out about the vicious mob beating she suffered Saturday at a neighborhood 7-Eleven, a beating she is certain came because she is transgender, born as a man, living as a woman for the past decade.
It was all about, you're a dude, this is why we're hitting you.
Police say a dispute with a teenage neighbor earlier in the day may have led to the attack. The victim had just left the 7-Eleven Saturday afternoon when 3 or 4 teenagers drove up and converged on her, backing her against the wall.
I feel something from behind just hit me, a real sharp blow. My ear rung, and I don't remember nothing else after that. I hit the ground.
As the victim lay in the parking lot, several witnesses called 911, but there was one person who came to her aid, a 45-year-old woman, her neighbor.
And a friend and neighbor actually covered the victim's body with her own body.
You don't think people are going to do that. I'm sorry. You don't think people are going to put themselves in a situation to risk their life for you, especially when they don't even know you. This lady barely knows my last name.
The victim suffered a deep gash in her mouth along with other cuts and bruises, but she was able to help police with information that identified the suspects. Charged with malicious wounding by mob are 18-year-old Lakita Webb and 19-year-old Farkeem French. Police are still looking for 2 other suspects.
To know that Fredericksburg police officers and detectives and stuff were right there when I needed them, it felt really good, and it makes me feel a whole lot safer.
This attack is the second on a transgender person in the Baltimore-Washington area in the past month. The victim says she'd watched the YouTube video of the attack on a transgender woman at a Baltimore McDonald's. In her case, she says the mental anguish is far worse than the pain.
Physically, the pain is nothing compared to emotional. It's nothing. It hurts. It really hurts to be treated like a dog. And that's the way I feel like I was treated like a stray animal.
In Fredericksburg, Julie Carey, News 4.
Well, welcome back. I don't want to say I hope you enjoyed that. I sort of hope you didn't enjoy that, but that's, you know, it's awful. But this kind of thing does happen. There's certainly a lot of violence, and you know, I don't want to say that you know, trans people are always the victims of violence, because often they're not. But there is a lot of violence aimed at us out there, and
Well,
it's just
and
hard. It's sort of hard
to take a page from Lee. When it happens, we need to stand up and say it happened.
Yeah. And
I'm comfortable doing that.
Yeah, that's
my personal.
It's hard to watch this kind of stuff and then be called. And that thing you were reading to me the other night, being pretty much labeled us. Pretty much said that all transsexuals are sexual predators.
Yeah, it was an op-ed piece from I think his name is Chris O'Brien. He's the son of the president of Connecticut Right to Life. As I understand it, he wrote into the Stamford Patch an editorial piece about this bill, about the anti-discrimination bill. And one of the lines in it was that if the bill were to pass, and this is inaccurate, but if the bill were to pass, he was talking about the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual and such, and said that there's like 22 sexual disorders in the DSM that would disqualify you from serving in public safety and disqualify you from serving as a prison guard. And if this bill were to become law, we wouldn't be able to weed out the transgender people from being prison guards, and they would help other sexual predators in prison.
Yeah, the inference being, of course, that we're all a bunch of sexual predators, which bothers me immensely. But anyway.
And then on top of that, just some of the rhetoric from the opposition that even implies that, okay, a guy uses the women's restroom. The implication of their argument is that every guy is a sexual predator just waiting for the opportunity to assault somebody.
Yes, which is crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
And should be insulting to 49% of our population.
Yeah. And we're going to run out of time really quickly. Maybe you guys could give us those hotline numbers one more time?
Sure. The English hotline is 1-888-999-5545. And the Spanish hotline is 1-888-568-8332. Oh, there they are, 8332.
And those are correct?
Yes. Yeah, those are both correct.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, and then just to kind of quickly loop back, because time is of the essence in contacting your senators about House Bill 6599, especially if the vote comes up tomorrow. It was a fairly close margin in the House. It was a 77-62 vote. After hours and hours of discussion. Yes. So it's really important, if you have time tonight, tomorrow morning, to visit ctequality.com. They have all the information about how to identify your state senator, how to contact that individual. They make it really easy. There's scripts that you can just copy and paste into an email that you can use if you leave a voicemail. But it's a great thing to do tonight and tomorrow.
Please do.
And I want to add that in the House debate, some of the Republicans who were against passing the bill, one of the arguments they made was that they hadn't received a single phone call or a single correspondence either way in support or against it. So how important could it be?
Yeah, it is important.
Don't think that someone else is going to do it. It's just a couple minutes to go to ctequality.com, get your senator's contact address, and send them a quick little email. Every single senator there's only 36 of them, they all need to hear from us.
Yes.
And they're not as scary as it. See, I think people feel really intimidated by the legislative process, but it's important to know that you employ those legislators, and they need to hear from you, and they want to hear from you.
And we have to go, but thank you guys for coming, and please come back and see us again so we can talk some more. Bye, everybody.